That courtroom had aired a lot of tense moments over the years, but nothing quite like this. 12-year-old Ethan Cole walked in wearing his AirPods Max, phone glowing in his hand, wearing an expression that said he'd rather be literally anywhere else on the planet. His sneakers, the kind that cost more than some people's car payment, squeaked against the polished floor as he slouched toward the defendant's table without so much as a glance at the elderly woman whose life he deliberately wrecked for TikTok views. The regulars in the gallery that morning had seen a lot of defendants come through those doors over the years. Grown men in cheap suits trying to talk their way out of unpaid debts, landlords squaring off with tenants, siblings fighting over a dead parent's furniture. What none of them had seen before was a child walk in, radiating this particular brand of indifference. Like the entire apparatus of the court, the cameras, the bailiff, the woman quietly waiting in the gallery, existed purely as background noise to his day. A few people in the audience actually exchanged glances when he walked in, the kind of look that says, well, this one's going to be something. What happened in the next several minutes would become one of the most shared courtroom clips ever recorded, passed around tens of millions of times across every platform, held up by parents and teachers everywhere as proof that consequences still exist, even in a world where kids can seem completely untouchable. Here's the part that makes this whole thing almost unbelievable. Ethan didn't just get a lecture. He didn't just lose the case. What happened to this entitled 12-year-old was so precise, so calmly furious, and so perfectly aimed at exactly what mattered most to him that it silenced not just Ethan, not just his enabling mother, but the entire room, and eventually millions of people watching from home who couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. Before we get to the moment Ethan called a decorated judge a name to her face and told her she had outdated energy, you need to understand who these people actually were and what brought them to this point. Because this was never about one rude comment or one ruined garden. This was about a pattern of behavior that had been building for years, enabled by a mother too afraid to actually parent, and aimed squarely at people who represented everything Ethan had never been made to face. If you think kids need to learn respect and parents need to actually parent instead of trying to be their kid's best friend, hit like right now. And subscribe, because what gets uncovered about Ethan's history in this one will genuinely surprise you. Stick with me. The next stretch of this story might just restore your faith that karma is real and that sometimes it shows up wearing a robe with zero patience left for entitlement. A kid built by every modern parenting mistake at once. Ethan Cole was, in a lot of ways, a perfect storm. At 12, he already had a TikTok account with 50,000 followers, built entirely around mocking adults, disrespecting authority, and turning getting away with it into a personality. His mother, Laura Cole, had spent the 3 years since her divorce trying desperately to be the fun parent, the understanding one, the friend instead of the authority figure who sets boundaries and actually enforces them. She worked as a marketing coordinator, made decent money, and spent a good chunk of it on Ethan. New gadgets, expensive sneakers, whatever he wanted, because saying no felt like conflict, and conflict felt too close to the marriage she was still trying to process. Ethan grew up with essentially zero real accountability. When he talked back to teachers, Laura blamed the school. When he was suspended 4 times in 2 years, she complained that schools didn't understand creative kids. When neighbors complained, she brushed them off as oversensitive and told Ethan to ignore the haters, the exact language he used for his TikTok comment section. Quietly, she'd already paid out $6,700 to 3 different neighbors over 18 months just to make problems disappear before they became anything official. It wasn't working. Ethan was getting more entitled, more aggressive, more convinced that his follower count made him important, that adults were just obstacles to mock, and that consequences were things that happened to other people. Laura wasn't a cruel person, and she wasn't stupid either. She knew, somewhere underneath the excuses she gave herself, that something wasn't right. She'd read articles about gentle parenting and told herself she was practicing it, when really what she was practicing was avoidance, dressed up as a philosophy. Every time she caved to one of Ethan's demands, every time she smoothed over a complaint instead of sitting her son down and making him actually answer for it, she told herself it was because she understood him, because she wasn't going to be the kind of rigid, unbending parent her own mother had been. What she didn't let herself think about, not really, was that Ethan had started to see her hesitation as weakness and had learned, with the efficiency kids have for these things, exactly how far he could push before she folded. He'd figured out a long time ago that the answer was always further than he thought. The person who finally changed all of that was Margaret Alvarez, 72, a retired teacher who lived next door and had spent 30 years tending a garden that was, in every real sense, a living memorial to her late husband. Now let's talk about Margaret Alvarez properly, because she deserves more than a footnote. Her garden wasn't just plants. It was 40 years of marriage to Carlos Alvarez, who'd passed away from cancer 3 years earlier. Carlos had planted the first rose bushes the week they moved into their modest home back in 1983, working the soil with his bare hands because they couldn't yet afford proper tools. Over 4 decades, that patch of ground had become something genuinely extraordinary. Rare varieties Carlos had cultivated from cuttings over the years, blooms in colors most people had simply never seen. Professional horticulturists had offered thousands of dollars for specimens. Margaret always said no. These weren't flowers for sale. They were Carlos's legacy. She lived on a fixed income, his pension, her modest teacher's retirement, and budgeted every penny carefully. She drove a 19-year-old Honda Civic Carlos had kept in perfect shape before he got sick. She clipped coupons, shopped sales, wore dresses she'd owned for 20 years because good clothing lasts if you take care of it. But the garden always got whatever it needed: special soil, organic fertilizer, the careful watering system Carlos had installed before his illness took over. Every morning she spent 3 hours out there, pruning and watering and talking to him the way you talk to someone who still feels close by, even though only she could answer now. Neighbors knew not to bother her before 10. Those hours were hers and Carlos's, and nobody touched them. Carlos had been a quiet man, the kind who showed love through small acts of maintenance rather than big declarations. He fixed things before they broke. He learned to prune roses from library books because they couldn't afford a course, and then, over years, got good enough at it that neighbors started asking him for advice. When the diagnosis came, late and aggressive, he spent his remaining good months teaching Margaret everything he knew, walking her through the garden bed by bed, explaining which varieties needed which kind of care, which ones were forgiving, and which ones would sulk for a season if you got the watering wrong. He used to joke that he was leaving her a garden full of homework so she'd never run out of things to do. She hadn't found it funny at the time. She found herself laughing about it, quietly, most mornings now. Ethan and his mother had moved in next door about a year earlier, right in the middle of the divorce. At first, the friction was minor, some loud music, ordinary kid noise, nothing that bothered a woman who'd spent 30 years as a middle school teacher and understood that children make noise. But Ethan's behavior escalated steadily, month after month, each incident worse than the one before it. It started with a basketball, deliberately bounced against the shared fence during her morning hours. When she asked, politely, if he could play in the afternoon instead, he laughed and did it more. Then came handfuls of trash thrown over the fence into her flower beds, forcing her to spend hours picking garbage out of her plants. Then it turned genuinely cruel. Ethan discovered that Margaret spoke with a slight accent. Spanish had been her first language, though she'd lived in the U.S. for over 50 years and spoke flawless English. And he started filming her without permission, mocking her pronunciation, posting clips online captioned things like, "My crazy neighbor," and "Why are old people so weird?" A woman who'd spent 15 years teaching English as a second language, who'd helped hundreds of immigrant kids succeed in American classrooms, was now the punchline for a 12-year-old who'd never had to work hard at anything. She talked to Laura about it. Laura apologized vaguely, promised to talk to him, and did nothing. The videos kept coming. And then came the morning that changed everything. Margaret woke at 6:30, as always, made her coffee, walked outside to start her morning with Carlos. What she found broke something in her that hadn't broken even the day he died. Her roses, her beautiful, irreplaceable roses, were dead. Not naturally dead, not disease, not neglect, chemically murdered. Someone had gone bush to bush with industrial-strength weed killer, making sure every single plant got a lethal dose. 40 years of cultivation, Carlos's entire living legacy, reduced overnight to blackened stems and collapsed petals. She sank to her knees in that ruined soil and cried in a way she hadn't cried since the morning he passed in their bedroom 3 years earlier. She might never have known who did it, except Ethan, with the same arrogance that defined everything he did, filmed himself doing it and posted it, climbing the fence at night, narrating the whole thing like a nature documentary, laughing about how Margaret would cry when she found her stupid flowers dead. 50,000 people saw it. Hundreds commented with laughing emojis, calling it an epic prank. 3 people who actually knew Margaret sent her the screenshots, unable to believe what they were looking at. At 72 years old, Margaret Alvarez did something she had genuinely never done in her entire life. She filed a lawsuit. Carlos had always believed in working things out through conversation, and she'd carried that philosophy through decades of teaching. But this wasn't something conversation could fix. Ethan had committed a crime, filmed himself doing it, and faced absolutely nothing at home for it. The police report led to a juvenile probation file, but the real accountability came through small claims court, where she sued for $2,400 to replace the roses and $800 for emotional distress. A number 3 separate horticulturists told her badly undervalued what she'd actually lost. A 40-year root system produces blooms a new plant simply can't replicate. If anything, she was lowballing her own loss. What Margaret didn't know was how far the judge's research team had already gone into Ethan's background. When his file crossed her desk, something in it set off every instinct built over 25 years on the family court bench, handling more than 20,000 cases. She sent her team digging, and what they found was a disturbing, years-long pattern quietly buried by a mother too scared to be a parent. 3 earlier incidents with other neighbors quietly paid off. School records showing repeated suspensions, psychological evaluations recommending intervention that had simply been ignored. Ethan's full social media history, including videos he thought he'd deleted, showing a clear pattern of targeting vulnerable people for content. She spent 3 nights going through all of it before walking into that courtroom, carrying something she rarely let herself feel anymore, after decades of watching human behavior at its worst: genuine anger. If you've made it this far, go ahead and subscribe. The courtroom scene itself is where this really turns. The room had its usual energy that morning, cameras rolling, an audience mostly made up of longtime viewers who came for exactly this kind of accountability. Nobody in that room had any idea they were about to witness something that would end up studied in parenting classes and shared by millions. Margaret entered first, moving slowly, the careful steps of someone whose knees have spent decades kneeling in garden soil. She wore her good dress, a modest floral one she'd bought years earlier and still kept immaculate, because quality lasts if you take care of it. Her daughter walked beside her for support, carrying a folder. Before and after photos of the garden, printouts from Ethan's video, statements from horticulturists, and a picture of Carlos planting those first roses back in 1983. Then Ethan and Laura came in and the whole room's energy shifted. Ethan walked in like he was strolling through a mall, AirPods on, phone at eye level, scrolling, completely checked out from the weight of where he actually was. He didn't acknowledge the bailiff. He didn't look at Margaret, 20 feet away. Laura trailed behind him in a blazer, visibly nervous, reaching for his shoulder, trying to get him to put the phone down, trying to project some scrap of authority. He shrugged her off every single time, his whole posture broadcasting that he had no respect left for her and no idea what was actually about to happen to him. The judge watched all of it with the calm, patient attention of someone who's read thousands of rooms before this one. Every dismissive gesture, every sign of entitlement, and something about this particular 12-year-old triggered every instinct she'd built over decades of handling exactly this kind of case. She'd seen entitled adults before, plenty of them. Grown men and women who walked in assuming their money or their title or their connections would carry them through. There was always something almost predictable about that kind of arrogance in adults. You could see the calculation behind it, the awareness, buried but present, that they were performing confidence rather than actually feeling it. What she was looking at with Ethan was different, and it took her a moment to place exactly why. He wasn't performing anything. He genuinely didn't understand that this room operated on different rules than the ones that governed the rest of his life. That, more than anything else, was what settled her resolve before a single word of testimony had even been spoken. The bailiff called the room to order. The proceedings opened with the judge's signature directness. Mrs. Alvarez, you're suing Ethan Cole for $3,200 in damages. Tell me what happened. Her tone was professional, but it carried an undercurrent, the sense that she already knew far more than the case file suggested. Margaret began her testimony with real emotion, describing the garden Carlos had planted 4 decades earlier, how those roses represented her entire marriage, how she spent every single morning talking to him while she tended what he'd built. She showed the before photos, a garden of genuinely breathtaking color, and then the after photos, blackened and withered, clearly deliberate. Then she played Ethan's video for the room, and the audience audibly gasped, watching a 12-year-old narrate the destruction of an elderly woman's most precious possession while laughing about how she'd cry when she found it. Through all of it, Ethan sat slouched with one AirPod still in, phone resting just below the table where he thought it was hidden. No remorse on his face, no empathy. He rolled his eyes when Margaret's voice cracked. He sighed loudly when she described Carlos planting each bush by hand. Something under his breath, barely caught by the mic, sounded a lot like, "So dramatic." Laura kept elbowing him, whispering for him to sit up, to behave, just for 20 minutes. He ignored every bit of it. The first direct address to Ethan came calm, deceptively calm. "Young man, put the phone away, now." He responded with an exaggerated sigh, the sound of a kid asked to do a basic chore, before sliding the phone into his pocket with movements clearly designed to communicate maximum disrespect through minimum compliance. One AirPod came out, the other stayed in, dangling on purpose. Laura launched into her defense with the desperation of someone who knew she was losing but had to try anyway. Ethan was fundamentally a good kid who'd made a mistake. Mrs. Alvarez was overstating the value of some plants. They're just plants, replaceable. He's only 12, doesn't fully understand consequences yet. Thought it was a harmless prank for his page. Kids today live in a different world. She'd already disciplined him at home, had long talks about respect and property, thought maybe they could settle this without such a big judgment. Every word out of her mouth made it worse. Each excuse just reinforced how many years she'd spent teaching her son that consequences were negotiable and that being young was its own exemption from accountability. The response to Laura came fast and precise. "Ma'am, at 12 years old, children absolutely understand right from wrong. They understand that destroying someone's property is wrong. They understand that causing pain to another person is wrong. Your son didn't just understand what he was doing, he filmed it. He posted it publicly. He laughed about making an elderly woman cry. This wasn't a prank. This was cruelty, staged for an audience." Then came the direct question to Ethan. "Do you understand that what you did was wrong?" And Ethan, with all the casual dismissiveness of someone who'd never once faced a real consequence, said, "I mean, like, it's literally just flowers. She can buy more. It's not that deep." The room gasped. Laura closed her eyes like she could make the moment disappear by sheer will. Margaret's daughter squeezed her mother's hand as tears started. "Not that deep," came the reply, voice dropping into something quiet and dangerous. "You destroyed something irreplaceable, and you think it's not that deep." And Ethan, emboldened by 12 years of getting away with absolutely everything, actually shrugged and delivered the line that sealed it. "Whatever, boomers are so dramatic about everything." The room went completely still, the kind of silence that stretches out and doesn't seem to end. The judge rose slowly from her chair, the kind of movement reserved for moments that genuinely demand it. Her voice, when it came, was deadly calm. "Excuse me, what did you just say?" Ethan, completely misreading the room the way he'd misread every authority figure in his life so far, doubled down. "I said boomers are dramatic. Like you're all the same, getting mad over nothing. It's giving old person energy, honestly." He actually smirked toward the camera as he said it, apparently expecting his followers to love the clip. Here's what came next, and I want to speak to you directly the way it was said to him. "Young man, let me tell you what I understand. I understand you are 12 years old, and you are already on a path to becoming someone nobody wants to be around. I understand your mother has failed you by never once teaching you that actions carry real consequences. I understand you think your followers make you important. They don't. They're watching you fail in real time, and they'll move on to the next thing without a second thought. What you don't understand is that you are not special. You are not unique. You are a child who's been allowed to act like a tyrant. And that ends today in this room. You destroyed something precious because you thought it was funny. You mocked a woman who has done absolutely nothing to you except exist near your property. You've shown no remorse, no empathy, and no respect whatsoever." By that point, Ethan's smirk was completely gone, replaced by what looked like the first real fear he'd felt in years. His face had gone pale as the record was laid out in full. The 3 earlier incidents with neighbors that his mother had quietly paid to bury, the $6,700 spent covering for him, the school records showing years of escalating problems, the psychological evaluations recommending help that Laura had simply ignored. Every fact landed on Laura like a physical blow, watching in real time as it became clear the court had already found everything, and there was no amount of money or excuses left to negotiate this away. Ethan sat frozen through the explanation of exactly what those 40-year-old roses actually meant, how Carlos had planted them while fighting cancer, how some of the cuttings had come from Margaret's childhood home in Mexico, tying her not just to her marriage, but to her own family history. How the $2,400 market value barely scratched their real, irreplaceable worth. Then came the ruling. The full $3,200 requested, the maximum small claims allowed, but the money was the smallest part of it. Ethan would personally restore Margaret's garden, 40 hours of labor over 10 consecutive Saturdays, supervised by a court-appointed mediator, no phone allowed at any point. He would write a formal, handwritten apology, no typing, no help. His TikTok account would be permanently deleted, every video featuring Margaret removed immediately. He'd be barred from all social media for 6 months, monitored by the court. Laura would enforce every condition or face contempt charges of her own. The punishment landed exactly where it needed to, stripping away the validation that had become his whole identity and forcing him into direct, unavoidable accountability with the person he'd actually hurt. Dismissed. Get out of my courtroom. 5 full seconds of total silence followed before the room broke into applause. Ethan was walked out by his mother, hunched over in what looked like genuine shame, maybe for the first time in his life. The clip spread within hours, watched tens of millions of times. Subscribe now if you want to see how this actually ends, because the real story isn't the courtroom. It's what happened over the 10 Saturdays that followed. Ethan showed up the first morning with his eyes on the ground, moving like someone who'd never done manual labor and had zero interest in starting. Nobody spoke. He worked in silence and left without a word. The second Saturday was the same. But Margaret noticed something. 30 years as a teacher had taught her to notice things in kids that other adults stopped seeing. He was watching her. Not the way he used to, sneaking a phone through the fence. Just watching, quietly, the way someone watches something they don't understand yet, but are starting to get curious about anyway. By the third Saturday, he asked a small question: why she pruned a certain branch at that specific angle. She answered it fully, patiently, the way she'd answered questions for 30 years in a classroom. Something shifted after that, slowly, the way things shift when you're not paying close enough attention to notice, until one day you look up and it's already different. He started arriving early, asking more questions, actually listening. Margaret began talking more freely about the garden, about Carlos, about coming to this country and building a life here, about students she still thought about years later. Ethan sat in the dirt with no phone to disappear into and simply listened to a 72-year-old woman talk honestly about her life. Somewhere in the middle Saturdays, he asked if she'd teach him some Spanish. She laughed, a real one, and said, of course. Near the end, he showed up with a small plant of his own. Nothing expensive, just something he'd picked out at a nursery after asking what would grow well next to what she already had. She found a spot for it. On the final Saturday, once the hours were logged and the order was satisfied, he didn't rush off. He stayed to finish a section he'd started. And before he left, he turned to Margaret, not the mediator, not the yard in general, and told her he was sorry. Not the formal written apology from weeks earlier, something shorter, unscripted, real. By then, an unlikely friendship had formed, a 12-year-old who needed to learn what empathy actually costs, and a 72-year-old woman who still believed, after everything, that broken kids could be reached with enough patience, enough boundaries, and enough plain honesty.